Hey, this is Heini, the founder of Vivino and host of this Vivino podcast. If you're a part of the Vivino community, thank you very much for that. Joining me today is co-founder at Vivino, Theis. Today we're going to talk about Vivino and the pandemic, and it was not a boring time for us. A lot was happening during the pandemic. It was a real boom and somewhat bust too, so an incredibly exciting period for us. Also a serious period, we'll get to that. And for that conversation, I've brought a very special guest, the Vivino co-founder, Theis. Theis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Heini.
So let's go straight to it. I mean, first and foremost, we have to address that this was a time when there was a lot of pain, people were sick, and people were dying. We were obviously influenced in a very, very different way. So we had a different experience than a lot of other people. But we're going to talk through all that. Let's get going by saying, let's set the stage a little bit here, Theis. Where were you living, and so on and so forth. And I'll talk a little bit about where I was, which was a little bit different.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I was in Copenhagen at the time, which is where we have our product and engineering department, which I at the time was running. You were in the US running the main business as CEO. I was a CPO in Copenhagen. It was a very global business, right? So we had me in Copenhagen with a massive team there, you in the US. We also had offices in Hong Kong, and we had it across Europe. So we really had this, I think, quite unique perspective from a first person in a global business of being impacted by this global pandemic that kind of spread in a really dynamic way. So it was really it was a tough time, very interesting time from a business perspective, but also very hard from a management perspective. How do you deal with this? A lot of unknowns, and just like the timeline was super unknown. I think looking at it today, it's easier to say, oh, how would you deal with it if you had to shut down the office for a year? But nobody had a timeline.
We just didn't know.
Nobody knew, right?
No.
So it was super tricky to navigate. Very interesting for me, and I think for a lot of us at that, as you say, like it was a good time for business. So you looked at your computer screens and things were looking good, and then you look out the window, you look at the news, and you just see pretty horrific things.
So we were sort of excited on the business side, but also like fearful about what was happening. Like,
yeah, for sure.
And also a little bit, even though we're middle-aged at least, we're middle-aged or somewhat not old at least. We were afraid of getting sick at the time too, right? So there was fear out there too. So like you said, I was living in San Francisco, just outside San Francisco, in a small house, and suddenly everything was locked down, and even the kids that were in college came back home. So what did you live in back then?
Yeah, I lived in an apartment. I thought it was big enough. I have two kids and a girlfriend at that time, and so I thought, okay, this is fine. I had an office, and I was like, okay, when the kids get older, they need each their room. I can just skip that office.
A lot of people felt that their house was big enough until COVID hit.
Yeah, exactly. And then I realized, oh, actually, I don't need. I can't live without the office at home. Actually, we need two offices. So it was tricky. Suddenly, my kids were obviously sent home from school. I had to be homeschooled. So a lot of things changed. I was privileged and lucky that actually, the working conditions in my home were fine. I think it was one of the things that really impacted a lot in terms of our employees. Not everybody had living conditions where they could just work from home, right? So this was a real issue.
Like two small kids and a small apartment, right? That is challenging at that point. And if you have two parents working too, that is really, really difficult. So let's set the stage a little bit more here. So from a business side of view, the first thing that we saw, obviously this was in the news, but we also had an office in Hong Kong. And we asked the people in Hong Kong, say, hey, you've already had a lockdown. What was that like? And this is January of 2020 already. So they did a written report on this, and it was quite interesting because we were really worried at this point. As soon as we started hearing this spreading, we actually did a hiring freeze, a marketing stop. We put the brakes on everything because we did not know what was happening. So with the information we had, that's actually what we did. So we told the guys in Hong Kong, hey, give us a write-up of this so we can share with the board and investors and so on. And the thing that was interesting there was, sure, there was a lockdown for like 4 or 5 days, and we can't ship anything. That's not good. But as soon as it opened again, there was more demand. So it was like nothing. And then as soon as they were allowed to ship, things went a little bit crazy. So we're like, okay, what the heck is this thing? So it was quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And the issue was that this was moving at different speeds in the different markets we were in, right? And we could see, obviously, there was a huge impact when there were lockdowns. You know, wine is a physical good. Somebody has to put the stuff in a box, and somebody has to deliver it to your door, and so on. So you need people working to do this. This is not a purely digital product, and we could see that when you had lockdowns, logistics were impacted. Like
totally.
Stuff just
we'll get to that in a second.
Shipped.
Yeah, we'll get to that. So I want to be aggressive on the timeline here. So I'm thinking you were in San Francisco around this time, and we had a board meeting, right?
Yeah.
So is this February? This is probably moving into February.
Yeah, this is February. I went to San Francisco. We were like, these lockdowns, they're in Asia.
Yeah.
We can do this. So I went to San Francisco for a board meeting.
Yeah.
Looking back, that was a really risky
It ended
move.
up being a board meeting between you and I.
Yeah, we had to cancel it because other people on the board didn't fly in.
No, exactly.
They were maybe more prudent in their carefulness than I was. But I flew in, and actually, I ended up flying out back to Copenhagen in just a few days before
everything.
there was re-lockdown. And I remember being at the office in San Francisco. One of our colleagues told us that her husband had gotten sick, and we weren't quite, and she wasn't quite sure what it was yet. And this was the first time I think that it got really close to me and like to my surroundings. That this is not just something going on in Hong Kong, going on in Asia. This is spreading. It's spreading fast, and who knows what the consequences are going to be. So I think that's when really the gravity of the situation really.
We actually had an employee coming in from China too, who was quarantined in the early days. One of our Chinese employees came back to San Francisco. I mean, the other story here was also that when we canceled the board meeting, we had arranged this fancy dinner. You remember this? So we had paid for like a 2-star Michelin restaurant, and we're like 15 people because everyone's flying in. We're going to have some nice food. And I ended up going with my kids and friends eating at this place. We paid for it already.
We're happy for you, Heini.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Good for you.
Yes, it was wonderful. So, cool. Okay, we're moving on here. And now the lockdowns are starting, right? So we're in March, and suddenly these press releases start, like in the US, like the president and the people around the president. In Europe, the prime minister and so on said, okay, now we're doing lockdowns. And it was a strange thing. Like, how did that affect you in Copenhagen?
Yeah, so I think Denmark was where the office was really quick to react, and also in terms of slamming the brakes on social interactions. Yeah. So we had pretty early on, as one of the first countries in Europe, we had a lockdown where the government came out and said, for people in the public sector, you have to work from home. In the private sector, it's up to you, but we highly encourage working from home.
And we follow those guidelines.
And we followed those guidelines. We had that as a pretty consistent policy of like, we're not going to make up our own rules here. We're going to follow the guidelines and recommendations from the authorities. Yeah. And so we did that. So we closed down. The good thing for I think Vivino in Copenhagen was we already had a pretty mature work from home policy. A lot of people would be working from home quite frequently.
Very distributed organization all over.
And also a very distributed organization. So we kind of, for a lot of people, they could work from home. Yeah. For others, it was much tougher. Like you said earlier, some people with small kids, small apartment. And also we have a lot of people in the Copenhagen office who are not from Denmark, right? Yeah. It's like the Copenhagen office is super diverse in terms of where people are coming from. I think it's around 25% that are from Denmark.
Yeah.
The
we
rest
have like
is from all
25
over
nationalities.
The world. Yeah. The rest is from all over the world, and that's great. It also means that a lot of them don't really have a huge social network in Copenhagen yet. And when you're then you're asked to like leave the social network that you do have, which is your office, your work, your colleagues, to leave that behind and start working from home. That can really be a mental strain.
Yeah, totally. And you don't know how long it is. I would say the lockdowns here were more reasonable. They were sort of relatively short compared to other markets. For us, my kids were both in college and they both came home. So the house that we had there wasn't that big and the walls weren't that thick. So it was also a little bit difficult, but for me, we just had a lot of fun. So in that sense, it was great, but definitely a new situation that you had to adapt to.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. I talk about a couple of things that happened. We're going to talk about the demand that sort of changes here really rapidly. But we saw a couple of other things, and one of them was price points came down. A couple of things that sort of changed. That the supermarket, I'm not saying we are a higher end, but we have a little bit higher price point than maybe a supermarket, but those came down, and that just makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, I think so. There's a popular narrative which is kind of easy to buy into about the COVID pandemic that alcohol consumption overall went up. Yeah. We didn't see that in the data, and I don't think it did happen. Obviously, what happened was that consumption shifted. Yeah. Right, people could no longer go to cafes and restaurants. Everything had to be consumed at home. So if you're in the business of selling wine online, obviously that means that your demand is going up. So for us as a business, while all these horrible things were going on in the world, we could see from a business perspective that actually, demand is going up. Yeah. Which was special for us because we had worked, as head of product, I had worked for years and years and years together with the team, like banging on that door of trying to get our users to realize that Vivino was more than just this wine app in their pocket that could tell you about the wine, that you could actually go to Vivino and buy wine. Like we had tried for years and years and years to change that narrative.
Is the best way to buy wine.
Yeah. We had tried to communicate that in so many ways and honestly had been really struggling to get that message across. Suddenly it happened. Like suddenly this was now the impetus for people to like say, oh, actually, I want to buy wine online and I have this great product in my pocket that I trust already, and now I'll try that out. So we saw an explosion in demand, like a pent-up demand that we'd just been building over all these years of a very loyal and trusting user base that suddenly realized that, okay,
let's do this.
Let's do this. A lot of people tried buying wine online for the first time.
Yeah.
And a lot of people just like that were already buying wine. Like I said, their consumption shifted from being in restaurants and cafes to also being at home, to being more at home. We just saw an explosion in demand, which was great, but also had a lot of challenges from a business perspective.
So imagine our partners that do most of the shipping of these wines, right? They're in a warehouse, and now there are restrictions. They say, hey, yes, we can go to the warehouse, but we used to be 10 people in the warehouse. Now we can only be 3. On top of that, we now have 3 times the demand. So things really clogged up in the system, and people were somewhat understanding as long as they had wine. But over time we got through that. But you had to communicate a lot and so on. We got the speed up over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we also had to be careful in the beginning. Obviously, we had to be careful with our messaging to our community, our users. We don't want to take advantage of the situation in the sense of like coming across as insensitive, right? But actually it worked out fairly well for us in the sense that, we actually couldn't keep up with the demand anyway. No. So we were actually holding a bit back anyway in the beginning because we had to get the logistics into place.
Specific markets like Italy, Northern Italy was hit really hard, and we have a lot of partners there. We just had to slow down, like promotions. We just stopped doing it because there was too much demand. We couldn't supply. So crazy time.
Another thing that really helped us was the marketplace structure that we had. Part of the wine you can buy on Vivino is based on the marketplace, meaning that we have hundreds of partners that are basically fulfillment centers for us.
Totally.
And the advantage was that they were all impacted in different ways. Yeah. So some of them were impacted really hard in their warehousing and logistics.
Because they might have had a restaurant or a retail shop that nobody was coming to, and now they could do this instead, right?
Exactly. So some were impacted negatively. Some actually had excess supply and so on. And we were able to then use that as we could shift the demand around.
Totally.
And we had some partners that were overwhelmed, right? that suddenly after a few days we could see, hey, you have 700 orders that you haven't fulfilled yet.
Yeah.
We're gonna
Let's
shift
pause
that.
it a little bit.
Let's pause you until you've caught up, and we're going to shift the demand to other suppliers on the marketplace.
And talking about so you could say, hey, we were lucky that this thing came and really showed what we could do, but we had built all these things and we were set up we were sort of ready when it happened, right? And that goes both for the supply, but also this transition in supply when things didn't work. It worked incredibly well, I must say.
Yeah.
I want to touch on another thing we saw in the app, which was quite interesting, was that we have this seller function in the app, right, where people can have their own seller, and then they can sort of add their wines and so on. And we saw that go crazy.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It also makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from product perspective, I was obviously worried about the pandemic from the product perspective that usage would go down. We have a lot of usage which is based on real world interaction. People drink wine together. And they go out.
And virality. We talked about that.
Yeah,
Why?
exactly.
How come it's still viral when people are in a bubble?
Yeah,
and it never changed. It just kept going. So that was weird.
Yeah. But exactly. And so we had so much usage that's like in supermarkets and shops and so on, which obviously went down. But then on the other hand, we saw that people going into this kind of collector mode, suddenly they cared a lot about the wines that they had at home. They used the
bored.
features. Yeah, they were bored, honestly. So they used the features of like, okay, now this is maybe finally the time that I'll organize my wine collection, or that I'll actually keep track of the 10, 20 wines I have on my shelf in the kitchen. Like stuff like that we saw going up.
Totally. And this leads to those months we were profitable. Everything was like, holy crap, things are amazing. And this was also true for a lot of e-commerce. And at the same time, the stock exchange starts exploding. There's a lot of cash, although also these checks in the US go out to people. So there's just a lot of money floating out there. This sort of leads to the next thing that's happening, and that's people coming to Vivino saying, hey, look, all your markers are green right now. You are growing, you are profitable right now. Your e-com, that's the hottest thing right now. And then we started sort of getting people reached out and said, okay, we would love to invest some money in you. At the time, we were okay on cash, but like if the right opportunity came, we would go for it, right? Strange period where that, like, you have a pandemic and then everything booms at the same time.
Yeah, emotionally it was actually hard to handle it. Obviously, you wanted to be happy about where you are personally, but you had to be really sensitive about your own privilege in that situation.
The obvious is obviously people that were dying and lost loved ones, right? But a lot of younger people were also struggling because of loneliness, and when you're young, a lot of your part is going out. Part of your life is going out and party, and you couldn't do that, right? So, and we said, yeah, whatever. But to them, that was important.
Yeah, for sure. And one issue we had internally in Vivino, like you said, we had a footprint that was pretty global.
Yeah.
And especially between the San Francisco office and the Copenhagen office, there was actually a huge difference on how people were impacted. The lockdown in San Francisco went on way longer.
Totally.
And the work from home policy went on for way
it's
longer.
Still on.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we had the office in San Francisco still isn't full. Like we had a hard time getting people back into the office.
So there was a much faster, like let's say, return to normal in Copenhagen than in San Francisco, and that created some tension. Yes. Like you had colleagues that were suddenly on different, let's say, playing fields or levels, and that creates some tension. Yeah. And you had to be really sensitive about that when you were communicating. And sometimes, I could be living in a Copenhagen bubble and thinking, oh yeah, the pandemic is over.
It's a long time ago.
Everything is great. Yeah. And suddenly you realize that, well, no, I mean, for our colleagues in San Francisco, it was a completely different situation.
Yeah, totally. And I remember that when we did sort of public announcements, and they felt like they were still talking about the pandemic. And at that point, I had moved back to Copenhagen, and it was just a weird dynamic all the time. And the same was true with schools and so on. Like they were literally closed for years. So it's a little bit different. But anyway, we get these investors in, and we get a lot of interest, and prices are high. So we couldn't help it. And by the end of 2020 got so interesting that early 2021 we raised a lot of money. So that was like the peak for us. But it was also early 2021. I'm not saying things started to turn there, but slowly during 21 going into 2022, things changed, right? We're now seeing a slowdown of e-commerce, and people are going out and people are reacting like, aggressively in the other direction. Like, I really want to go out for dinner now, right? So things were really changing there after we did the fundraise. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. And that was the big question for us, right?
Yeah.
The growth we'd seen, would it be sustainable?
Yeah, we thought so, obviously.
On the other side, right?
We bought our own bullshit.
Yes. We drank the Kool-Aid.
Yes.
And we said, okay, this is like, we've reached a new level.
Yeah.
And I think there were a lot of mistakes made by us in that period.
Definitely.
And a lot of wrong analysis of like what was fundamentally going on.
Yeah.
One thing that I think clearly was underestimated was there was a lot of money from consumers that had shifted, like their spending had shifted, because there was a lot of stuff they couldn't do during the pandemic.
No.
Like, you couldn't go traveling, you couldn't go, and if you know, like, whenever you leave your house, you spend money. Like, that's how it works, right? You cannot step onto the street without starting spending money, even if it's just on a cup of coffee. And so when you're in lockdown and you have to stay at home, you're not spending that money. But then you spend it online, and then you spend it on, like, okay, let's.
It just feels like there's more money now.
Yes,
All that coffee
exactly.
is not being spent now. So
but there's not, right?
No.
So when the world reopens, all that spending that has shifted, a lot of that changed back.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I underestimated was there was a lot of talk about, like, how the pandemic would change our habits fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
Remember all the talk about, like, oh, handshakes are done.
Yeah.
Like, we'll never shake hands again. That's going to stop. Well, guess what? Like,
we're still doing it.
We're still doing it. And
I mean, this is getting a little bit more market share. I will say
a bit more on the fist bump, right?
A little bit more, yeah.
But so the point is, we're going back to our habits to a large extent, right? And that also happened with consumption. And I think we made the wrong analysis that all these people that had started buying wine online, that they would continue to do so, and because we kind of broken the door and so on, and it was just wrong. Like, a lot of them went back,
and the reason for that is that because we, as a tech company and as sort of tech people, whatever we want to call it, we live in our own bubble, and our thinking was like, well, finally the world comes to its senses and buys online, like we've done for a long time, right? So this all makes sense. But that just wasn't the case. That just wasn't the case.
No. So, in short, we've had a COVID hangover.
For
in
sure.
that sense, right? From a business perspective.
And what happened was, if we look at the numbers now, it feels like, hey, there is, if you go like 18, 19, 20, 21 and so on, there's definitely a positive trend, but the entire COVID is like a bump there. And then it comes down to that line, which has a constant growth of e-commerce and so on.
Exactly. I think the business people will call it like a demand pull forward.
Yeah.
That it's like, you thought the demand is going to come a bit sooner than you had, but then it's going to slow down and even out again.
Totally.
And in the big picture, it's still a growing curve.
Yeah.
But you're going to have a slow period after the massive growth.
Totally. But industries are different, right? So the thing about wine is that, yes, there was this pull forward, but people buy a bottle of wine, then they drink it and need a new one, right? So some of the things I heard about gym equipment and so on was that, like, people bought their gym equipment and their demand for the next 5 years was done.
Yeah.
Right. So some of those were in really big trouble, right?
Exactly.
Where ours is a little bit more fluid, I would say.
I made the massive mistake of selling my rowing machine like 2 months before the pandemic started. And then obviously I had to buy a new one.
Yes,
once the pandemic started, which was overpriced and couldn't be delivered.
You couldn't even get free shipping on that.
Yeah.
No.
And now I sold it again. So you're right.
Your timing's off on this one.
Yeah.
No, I bought one also, and it was like hard to get. So it was not easy. The challenge that we had, just linking it back to the fundraise, was also that once we had done this fundraise, obviously we're going to go into growth mode. We have a lot of money. And at the same time, the market is going down. Yeah. So that was like a classic sort of, hey, you've raised a lot of money, you got to go invest it. So at the same time as we're increasing our cost, the market is just going down. Yeah. And that was obviously a big challenge. And for us, I think, it probably took us a little bit too long to realize that and say, okay, we got to do something else here. But now we have, but that was interesting.
Absolutely. And, it also made us realize that we have to have a business that has multiple legs to stand on.
More diverse.
right? We need to diversify the business. It's amazing that we're making wine from making our users happy by getting them great wine. But the more legs we can stand on, the better, right? So that's also why we started looking into, okay, can we make a paid version of the digital product? Can we make a premium version for those interested in that? And other ideas to kind of try to diversify the business.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. Like when you have an early stage startup, you would normally say, hey, focus on one thing, be a world champ. But once you get later, you have to think differently. I think a good example of that is also Uber and Lyft, right? So Lyft doubled down on the driving people from A to B. Uber decided to do Uber Eats, and a lot of people say, you're doing too many things. But then when the pandemic hit, suddenly that became their business, right? So they did much better because of that. So yeah, so like I say, we've now launched premium and have sort of diversified our revenue streams, and that has been really, really important for us. I think what we realized after the pandemic is that e-commerce marketplace is still the biggest contributor for this business, but it's just not enough to build a growth business. We need a couple of other things too, and that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any final comments? Any final thoughts on this that we might have missed?
Well, I think for me, COVID was a massive learning experience. It was such a dynamic situation, and you just had to constantly try to adapt to the world changing around you. And then we had to constantly adapt to the world changing after the pandemic as well. So really tricky, lots of lessons. As everybody else, I wish I had all the information beforehand.
Yes.
Looking back, I think most of our decisions really made sense with the information we had at that time. But obviously, you could have played your cards much better if you had like perfect information, especially around like timelines and how people's habits would change. Yeah,
and like I think that if there's one word like adapt, being able to adapt, I think the people that were able to do that, they just did the best. Like, we talked about us here, but it could also be a restaurant that didn't do takeaway before and they just changed it. We got to do takeaway now and so on. So that's really a learning. You have to be ready whatever comes, because something's going to come and it's going to surprise you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, reacting fast.
Yeah.
I think you very rarely make a mistake by reacting fast, rather than just sit and try to wait and see if it doesn't go back to something. Like react fast.
When was the last time you did something too quickly?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just, so cool. With that, thank you very much, Theis. And we're going to do knuckles. Boom.
Boom.
That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you check out the 2 other episodes we have out there too. And we'd love to hear from you. We have an email called podcast@vivino.com. You can record something and send it to us. Maybe it'll be featured on this show. So either way, we'd love to hear from you. And please like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you very much for listening.